I'd like to begin by saying a few words about the program. This event is part of the David Everett Post-Conflict Reconstruction Speaker Series. The series is now 4 years old, and its purpose is to bring subject matter experts, professionals, and academics who study conflict and post-conflict studies to help engage with our students and faculty and the students who participate in our certificate program in post-conflict reconstruction. It's supported by a generous law alum who is a practicing attorney in Manhattan who also happened to be a reserve Army colonel who's been called back out of retirement twice to actually serve as a police advisor both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And turning to our guest speaker who just had a recent experience there, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Erik Leklem of the Office of Secretary of Defense Policy. Mr. Leklem has over 16 years of experience in national security, foreign affairs, and defense policy as an analyst, organizational strategist, planner, and in related leadership positions with OSD policy, which he's worked at since 2004, and he's worked with DoD since 2000. Currently, Mr. Leklem is a senior advisor for global defense reform in the Office of Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Partnership Strategy and Stability Operations within the policy shop. In this capacity, is a policy director for the Defense Institutional Reform Initiative. This $12 million DoD capacity building program focused on supporting partner nations in their recent efforts to improve the professionalism and democratic governance of their defense institutions with a significant emphasis on ministries of defense. In 2011 and 2012, Mr. Leklem was a ministerial advisor serving as a senior advisor to Lieutenant General Hamidou Fauzi, Assistant Minister of Defense for Strategy and Policy within the Afghan Ministry of Defense. His other assignments were as team lead within OSD Policy Strategy Office, as a Senior Strategy Advisor for the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, QDDR, on detail to the U.S. State Department, as well as Chief of Staff for one of the 5 issue teams for the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review. He's a former Council on Foreign Relations term member and a Presidential Management Fellow. Erik is currently a delegate of the U.S.-Japan Leadership Program and fellow of the Truman National Security Project. He's a proud Oregon Duck, graduating from the Robert D. Clark Honors College with a BA in Political Science, as well as the University of Maryland, College Park, with an MPP in International Security and Economic Policy. Please join me in a warm welcome for our guest, Mr. Erik Leklem.
Great, thanks, Nick. And thank you to Maxwell School, the Institute, especially Nick, for all that you did to get me up here along with the rest of the team, making lasting reservations for I also want to thank, I know David's not here, but David for sponsoring this series. It's a fantastic opportunity for staff, faculty, and students in the community to get exposed to different kinds of thoughts from hopefully policy practitioners, but others as well. So I feel very fortunate to be part of this speaker series dialogue. Speaking of, I'm glad to see so many people here during the last couple weeks of school. I was prepared for about 5 people to show up, so thank you very much for taking some time away from grading papers or preparing to grade the papers and studying. It's a lot. Since we have a larger group than I anticipated, we may not have time to go around and do introductions, but could I just do by a quick show of hands people that are faculty? Great. And students? Is there a different category out there? Please feel free to speak up. Okay. Anyone here that has been to Afghanistan or has experience on Afghanistan issues? Okay. And if I say security sector reform, how many people would know what that is and have worked on security sector reform issues in the past? Okay. I just want to get a sense kind of that. Again, it's a great honor, and I was trying to do some reading up on Maxwell School, and I came across George Holmes Maxwell, if I have that right. I was really intrigued to read about his focus on the original vision for the school in terms of focusing on citizenship. And I saw the debate on your, I think it was on your 75th anniversary website, between Mr. Maxwell and then Representative Frederick Davenport, who thought the mission of the school should be to train people to go out into the world. I think the issue of citizenship and going out and doing good in the world actually perfectly encapsulates what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'd love to come back to those themes because I think they hopefully will resonate with this crowd here at the Maxwell School and by extension at Syracuse University. So I'm really here to talk about three things. One is the U.S. mission in Afghanistan over the last decade plus, and then up to 2014 and beyond transition. There are some risks that I see in mission accomplishment, and risks that may not be well known or understood in the broader policy and practitioner community related to ministerial capacity building, ministerial development. And then I would love to talk about lessons from Afghanistan for the future, for future security sector reform environments. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So in particular, I'm going to focus on U.S. governance and capacity building, and then as a subset, the democratic governance of security forces, what that means. I'm going to focus on the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior and the government of Afghanistan. And I'm going to give you a sense of who was conducting the mission over the last decade plus, primarily but not only U.S. and some coalition ministerial advisors. Nick asked me to talk a little bit too about what is a ministerial advisor. You see some pictures up here on the slide, so hopefully you're getting some visuals. But, I can talk about that in the context of my remarks. I'm happy to do that. The other thing that Nick asked me to talk about was the tension between policy development and policy implementation. I think what I will share from my observations in Afghanistan are a perfect case study in that regard. So that's what I'd like to talk about. Before I get into my arguments, I'm going to give you my classic disclaimer. I am not here in an official Department of Defense capacity. Anything I say or imply or show you on the screen is my personal professional reflections. So I do not reflect the position or the authority or U.S. policy associated with the Department of Defense. I'm really here in my capacity as a former advisor in Afghanistan and someone who is both interested and concerned in our national security. So if that sounds reasonable, I can proceed into my discussion. And I would love for this to be collaborative and really a discussion. So out of all of that, are there any things that people would like me to focus on in particular, or does anyone have any questions up front that I can try to weave into my remarks? Okay, great. Please feel free to interrupt. Again, I don't want this to be just me sitting out here delivering. So, I think we're going to try to spend about 20 minutes with remarks and then leave as much time as possible for Q&A. And get out here. So in this conversation, I'm going to try to posit three main arguments. One, that our U.S. mission in Afghanistan as we approach 2014 transition is at risk. It's at risk because of actions that we haven't taken in the United States and with the coalition over the last 11 to 12 years in Afghanistan. And many of those mistakes and missteps are in the mission set of the ministerial capacity building and really democratic governance as it pertains to the security sector. The good news is that there are actions, this is the second argument, that we can take to address those risks before 2014, and I'd like to talk about those, my observations and thoughts, as well as what we can do after 2014 when we have full transition in Afghanistan. That's the second argument. The third is I would love to share some of my lessons from Afghanistan and my thoughts on what that might be for future security sector reform environments, both post-conflict but also as a preventative tool of statecraft. And that's essentially my discussion. So if we run out of time, I will try to leave some of this in the Q&A. That's not good. Because we have a pretty diverse crowd, what I'd like to do is just give a little bit of context on Afghanistan and the issues that I'm going to raise. I think as most of you in the audience should know, we are approaching what is known as transition in 2014, where the first phase of the international commitment to Afghanistan will conclude. Afghanistan will be fully sovereign and fully responsible for their security responsibilities across the country of Afghanistan. So all of our efforts as the United States and the coalition have been building up to this moment in 2014, when the Afghans will be able, theoretically, to completely govern and control their geographic space and their security, and provide governance and security to their citizenry. As many of you know, we're in the middle of a very heated and high-level discussion in the U.S. government about what our U.S. commitment will look like through 2014 in terms of troop levels, in terms of level of effort, in terms of resources. That's necessarily being impacted by broader discussions across the government and across this country with regards to our economic situation and our national budget level. We're also in a very deliberate conversation with our allies and partners that have been assisting the Afghans over the last 11 to 12 years, principally through NATO, but also other partner nations that have contributed a lot, both in terms of blood and treasure, but also long-term development assistance. Of course, one of the big planning factors in the next couple of years is the Afghan election. The presidential election will happen hopefully in early 2014, and that has a very important impact on the security situation. It also has very important implications for the subject matter that I'm going to talk to you about today. Of course, the insurgents get a vote, maybe not at the polling stations, but definitely in combat operations, in their insurgency, and their activities, not only in country but out of country. And there are also a number of regional players that are also very involved in Afghanistan's future, whether it's Iran, Pakistan, the Stans, China, a number of other actors in the region that are going to be impacting Afghanistan's future, not only now, but in the next decade. So for this discussion, I'd like to talk about what I think is one of the critical paths to U.S. success in Afghanistan. And I think it's a classic public policy problem. So perhaps appropriate for even diving into this a little more in this environment. I think the question before really Afghanistan and the international community is, how can their society, the Afghan society, that their public sector acquire and exercise authority to provide public goods and manage public goods in distribution to their citizens. And the government needs to demonstrate capacity to do that, but also demonstrate accountability with their citizens. In Afghanistan, what I'd like to focus on for this discussion is the provision of democratically controlled and governed security, and the provision of that security through civilian control of lethal force in defense of Afghanistan's citizens, both internally and on the borders of Afghanistan. Several of you in the audience probably are aware that we are in the middle of the back end of building the Afghan National Security Forces, for Army and police, up to a force structure of about 352,000. That has both an Army component, but also a small Air Force element, and several law enforcement / police forces in that broader section of security forces in Afghanistan. Over the last 10 to 11 years, we've focused on growing, quote-unquote, the fangs of Afghanistan security forces. And my supposition before you today is that we need to focus more on allowing the mind of the institutions of Afghanistan associated with the security sector to continue to grow and develop into their own, which will ultimately be, I think, the solution to long-term Afghan sustainable security and resilience in the face of the challenges that they will have over the next decade. And when I say the mind of Afghanistan's security sector, I'm really talking about the institutions that sit atop the security forces. Principally the ministries, the governing bodies of state that are constitutionally assigned the responsibility of overseeing Afghan security forces and also controlling their employment within the borders of Afghanistan. I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of U.S. and coalition efforts in this mission, because I think it's important to the context of our discussion. I won't dwell on it and can answer questions about the history as a result of some of the research I've done over the last year. U.S. efforts to build Afghanistan's security sector in conjunction with the Afghans go all the way back to the immediate days after the intervention, shortly after the 9/11 attacks. And it's important to understand that this has been a decade-plus effort that has not just been U.S., but it has been really an international community effort with the UN, NATO, the United States, and a handful of other countries that have been focusing on helping the Afghans build a truly resilient security sector. That campaign has taken on many forms. I use the metaphor of a relay race. If we have any track stars out there in the audience, you're familiar with what a 4x4 relay is. We've been essentially conducting a 12 or 13 by 400 relay over the last 10 plus years. My vision of that relay is we've had several people in the security sector in terms of capacity builders in different tracks. We've got the U.S., we've got NATO, we've got UN members, we have non-governmental organizations. They all have their batons, and in 2001 they started racing off with the Afghans. And as people went around the track, they came up to the time to hand off the baton in 2002, and some people didn't find anybody to give the baton to. Some people handed off a baton to a different coalition partner. Some people showed up there and kept running. They did their second year in theater. And around we have gone as not only the United States and the coalition. Unfortunately, several cases, people have showed up at the track, and there was no one running to them to give them a baton. They just found a baton in their lane and started running with it. So it's important to understand that the issues that I'm going to talk about in the kind of period of 2011 to 2012 are set in the context of a decade plus of effort by a range of actors that has been highly complex because it's happened over several years. It's been a number of different project streams, as Dave and I were talking about earlier today. And the handoffs in that mission have not always been clean or successful or complete. And you've had people wandering in at different times to pick up batons that weren't necessarily theirs, and starting to run essentially amok in the system. Out of the 2001 effort to work with the Afghans to establish their government through the international community's efforts, the United States quickly picked up the responsibility of developing with the Afghans their army for the future. That meant both the security forces and then their nascent Ministry of Defense at the time. At that time was sort of 2001, 2002, the international community's understanding was that Afghanistan would probably be fine with 50,000 Army soldiers, plus or minus. That sort of changed over the years as the security condition changed, but it was sort of about that number. About 2005, the international community recognized that because of the worsening security situation in Afghanistan, the international coalition's effort to build security forces in Afghanistan was not fully successful. Because of some agreements that were reached through the G8 process in 2002, the security sector had essentially been splintered across 5 different lines of effort with different national sponsors. The United States had the Army. Law enforcement, for example, was given to the Germans. And I will go into the other pillars, but essentially we collectively realized in about 2005 that the efforts of growing up the police forces and the ministries associated with the police were not successful. The Germans had designed an approach that was really looking long-term, was focusing more on training police forces, as opposed to sort of building up immediately employable police forces for security provision within Afghanistan. Fast forwarding, 2005, the United States inherits the role of training up police forces in addition to the Army. Several more years go forward, half-hearted attempts, needing to grow the Army and the police forces, combat operations intensify, security condition in Afghanistan worsens. And about 2009, there's a NATO and international agreement that the training efforts for the security forces and the ministries needs to be more joined up. An organization called NATO Training Mission Afghanistan is established, and there is a redoubling of effort in association with of the Obama administration's policy to surge into Afghanistan and redouble our efforts to try to improve the security situation and therefore governance and development in Afghanistan in the interests of the United States. I arrived in Afghanistan in March 2011, about 2 years into this reinforced, reinvigorated effort to build capacity up and down and around the security forces of Afghanistan. At that time, the mission to develop not just the Army and the police forces, but those ministries, all belonged to NATO Training Mission Afghanistan. And it was a dual-hatted command, both NATO and U.S. The U.S. command was what was called Combined Security Transition Command Afghanistan, T-Stick Alpha. At that command, you had a 3-star general who was in charge of that mission set, both growing the Army and the police, but also the ministries of state. A very complex and sophisticated command structure to focus on tactical level training, operational headquarters development, and then those ministries at the strategic level that are all necessary for the provision of public good of security, and all in conjunction with other commands like ISAF Joint Command, the Operational Warfighting Command for the coalition. A very complex command structure to help Afghanistan build their security forces. At the time that I arrived, the ministerial capacity, the effectiveness of the Afghan Ministry of Defense, which is what I'll focus on in my remarks, was assessed at being moderately successful, moderately effective with pretty heavy coalition assistance. There was an assessment process and framework that I can talk about, labeled out how we kind of graded their capabilities. But that was the environment that I walked into. As Nick mentioned, I was assigned as the senior civilian advisor to a part of the Ministry of Defense that focused on strategy and policy. I was assigned to an advising team that consisted of a British 06 who was in charge as the senior military advisor, and we also wore a couple other hats in command. And there was an advising team of contractors, an Estonian civil servant, and U.S. and British military officers that were also working in this particular office that represented really the strategy and planning and policy development function within the Ministry of Defense. Nick asked me to talk a little bit here about what an average day looks like, and you've seen some pictures sort of circulating above my head. I would expand the scope a little bit and really talk about kind of what a typical week looked like. Generally what we tried to do at the command that I was at, NATO Training Mission Afghanistan, we're based at Camp Haggers in the Green Zone, about a block and a half away from the Ministry of Defense. Our week consisted of both planning meetings on the coalition side to make sure that as the advising teams were working over in the Ministry of Defense and the Afghan National Army General Staff, the uniformed staff headquarters, that we were generally going in the right direction together. We were working on goals that were common and unified. And then we would go over to the Ministry of Defense and work with our counterparts on a daily or near daily basis, usually in the mornings before lunch, and episodically in the afternoons, because at this point in time we were trying to also give the Afghans some time actually just to do their own jobs, manage their offices, complete projects that have been assigned to them by higher level ministerial officials or others in the command structure. So that was essentially the kind of the week. Some days you have more meetings with your Afghan counterparts, but really the job of the advisor team was to work in conjunction with a particular office or a leader to identify what their goals were for building the capacity of their office or their function, identify work projects that were of importance to them and to the Afghan government associated with the security sector. And our role was to advise them on better ways of conducting their business, ways to build staff processes, planning processes so that they could do their jobs better. Also to carry information and messages from the U.S. government or the NATO coalition in terms of things that were important to the coalition, So there was a little bit of defense diplomacy that was conducted as part of our job as well. And of course, always responding to the daily events that were happening in Afghanistan, whether it was me needing to deliver an apology for U.S. soldiers disgracing Afghan citizens' bodies in an attack, whether it was requesting information from our Afghan counterparts about a particular decision made by the Karzai government and get their perspective on what that meant. So I can take more questions in Q&A about what an advisor day is like. It's probably a longer conversation. I can talk about some pictures too, if that's it. I'd like to pivot a little bit now and really talk just at the sort of wave top level about the three things that are of concern to me with regards to the mission historically, where we're going in the future, and sort of those lessons for the future. And before I go into the lessons observed of failure or missteps in the mission, I do want to take a moment to recognize that there has been a lot of success by the United States and the coalition in helping the Afghans and supporting the Afghans in their desire to build an Afghan government, to build up their security forces, to take control of their own country, and to be responsible for their own security. I don't want to give anyone in this room the impression that the Afghans that I work with were not fully on board with that notion, that they weren't thirsty to take control, and they weren't eager to have the sovereign responsibility of, again, providing that security to their citizens. Several years and really a decade more of effort was put in by literally hundreds of thousands of U.S. service persons, U.S. civilian personnel from the Department of Defense, contractors, coalition members, military and civilian. And there were some successes by the time that I arrived in 2011. First, that there were actually ministries of state associated with the security sector, and they were established and they were manned and they were functioning at some level was a major achievement in the conflict zone. There was an Afghan constitution that provided restraints and constraints on the use of force in Afghanistan. There were policies and procedures that had been established, if not always followed, in the ministries. There was something called the Organization and Functions Manual, which was essentially a blueprint for the design structure of the Ministry of Defense, the Afghan General Staff, the subordinate commands, and the corps and CANDACs all the way down to the tactical level of platoons that did exist on paper and identified roles and responsibilities within the Ministry of Defense and mechanisms for coordination. We had invested a lot of time and effort in training and educating Afghan leaders and senior officers, and that was beginning to pay off. I was lucky enough to be assigned to some really inspirational Afghan senior leaders and mid-level officers who had struggled through over 30 years of conflict to get to where they were to conduct their business on a daily basis, and it was truly inspiring to work with them. But because of those inspirational Afghans and because of the scope of work that was involved, I did find myself observing a lot of missteps and frankly failures amongst the coalition in the United States that I thought were important to record and to research further after I got back from Afghanistan. So in terms of failures, I do think there is a need for us to be collectively more honest with ourselves as we look back over the last 10 plus years in Afghanistan. Specifically in this mission set of supporting the Afghans in building their ministries of defense and Ministry of Interior. There were a couple examples that stand out to me as I look back where we just misread Afghan culture. We tried to mirror image our systems and structures onto the Afghans, and we didn't listen to the Afghans when they were signaling that our ideas weren't going to stick, that they weren't going to matter, that they weren't going to endure. So I'll provide just 3 simple examples of where I thought there were some pretty classic failures on the part of the coalition. There are more that I can talk about in Q&A. And then I'll talk later about kind of where we go from here and lessons for the future. So the 3 examples that stand out to me in this group are the establishment of something called Ground Forces Command. This was an intermediate command structure Afghan National Army. There was also the civilianization or the development of the civil service cadre, or the lack thereof, in the Ministry of Defense. And then thirdly, there was our imposition of a very complex annual planning and strategy cycle on the Afghan. So Ground Forces Command. For those of you that aren't familiar, in most Western command structures, there are a number of different levels of command structures to make sure that we have unity of effort, unity of command, shared information, and coordination of military forces in the field. When I arrived in 2011, there was a notion of that the Afghans needed to have a 3-star level operational command that largely mirrored our ISAF joint command structure. IJC, as it was called, lacked a counterpart in the Afghan system that looked like it, that had 3 stars on the command coordinate order chart, and performed similar functions to it. We had received several indications from Afghan senior general officers, ministerial officials, that this command structure was not necessary, did not fit into the Afghan conceptualization of warfare, which is strategic and tactical, doesn't really have an operational level. But our institutions and our processes forced ourselves into a box where we basically developed a command structure at heavy cost, heavy time and effort, and a significant advisor laydown to establish a command structure that the Afghans told us repeatedly would not endure after 2014. So Ground Forces Command, I think, is an example of a regret that we will have in retrospect as we look back on this time frame. And I can talk more about this later. The second, I think, area of failure that I observed was it was essentially 10 years into the campaign when I arrived in Afghanistan. And as a civil servant coming from the Department of Defense, one of the things that I was interested in was speaking with the Afghans about their conceptualization of civilian control of the military in that country, and what we were doing as a coalition to help them get to that destination, which is an international recognized best practice for democratic control of security forces. I was disappointed to discover that when I arrived, there were 18 civil servants working in the Ministry of Defense. And essentially our program of developing a civil service cadre that could perform those inherent governmental functions, personnel policy, human resource management, budgetary systems, acquisition policy, developing strategy policy that would be provided to military forces. Those functions were essentially all being done by Afghan military officers with very little civilian Afghan input because there was no civil service cadre really in the Ministry of Defense. The British had a capacity building effort that was trying to tackle this problem, and the U.S. Agency for International Development was developing civil servants for other Afghan ministries but had basically opted out of working in the security sector. So we had this gap that was not really being filled by the British, it was being essentially opted out of by our own U.S. agencies, with all those sort of resulting impact. And again, one of those things as we look back, could we have done more over the last 13 years to develop a civil service cadre that would allow the ministry to be more professional and probably provide a level of expertise that would be resident right now in the government of Afghanistan? Of course. I could talk more about ideas for how you do that better in the future. The third failure that I'd like to share, just because it was one of the issues that I was working on as a ministerial advisor, was we were, in the space that I was working in terms of capacity building, was helping the Afghans to understand the value of strategic planning, of looking out beyond just the next week or a month out, and actually identifying how Afghanistan's security interests and the threats to those interests translated into guidance and policy for the Afghan military, and how their operations should be conducted in alignment with those strategic policy goals and objectives, and a diagnostic of the security situation, both internally and externally. What I walked into was a capacity building effort that had resulted in the Afghans adopting an annual planning cycle that required them to develop a national military strategy, several subordinate operational guidance documents, and a budget on an annual basis every year. We don't even do that in our own country to ourselves. And yet we have allowed, through a variety of reasons, our U.S. capacity building effort to basically force a very complex, very cumbersome strategic planning process onto an Afghan ministry that neither had the human capacity nor the processes in place to do that successfully. But what I heard from trainers and advisors that I've been on the ground with before me, they said, well, this would be a good way of getting the Afghans to practice this process. Again, we don't do it to ourselves when we're trying to develop our own personnel into strategic planners, and I think this was another area where we could have done a lot better. We could have approached it from some best practices within the development sector that would have allowed the Afghans to be more successful more quickly, and we probably would have had our interests better defended because their strategic planning process would be simpler, more sustainable, and more responsive to our needs in country while executing our campaign objectives. So my message is the mission is at risk because we continue to allow some of these failures to go forward. There are a number of reasons, I think, why we got to this place where we are in Afghanistan. And I'd like to pivot to, right now, what are some of the actions that I think we need to take as the United States, as well as the coalition, especially NATO, to get things better before 2014. I think the first thing is for our national leadership to recognize that we actually have a problem at this mission stage. Because it is not an area that tends to be focused on either in training or doctrine, in terms of prior military operations, except for maybe Iraq, our sort of institutional body of knowledge about how to conduct this mission set is not robust. And so I think our national leaders are now beginning to understand that we do have some risk in this area. General Dunford, Lieutenant General Tobo, new commanders in the field that are responsible for these sorts of issues have identified ministerial capacity building and development as an issue area that they know that they need to fix, and they're focused on it, which is great. General Dunford just mentioned this in his testimony to Congress last week. We also have senior leaders, political leaders in the United States as well as NATO, as they're contemplating 2014 and the responsibilities that we have as an international community, that security level governance in Afghanistan is an area that is weak and in need of additional attention. So that's good. We have an opportunity as command structures are being reformatted in theater to rethink how our organizational structures in terms of building capacity are reoriented and how we have clear responsibility and accountability for this mission set. I think there's a lot that can be done to improve the role of the Agency for International Development in the State Department in the execution of the capacity building mission, which was a big gap that I saw in 2011, 2012. Unfortunately, conversations that I thought just should have happened between the political military section of the embassy, some of the democratic governance elements of the USAID mission, and what we were doing in terms of really development work at the ministerial level should have been more joined up and should have enjoyed better unity of effort and theater. And I think there's plenty of room for improvement as we go to different embassy and USAID mission structures and theater. Nick and I have talked about this in sort of prior conversations, but there's plenty of work to be done too in terms of actually improving how we man train, equip train our advisor cohorts that go into Afghanistan to work with our Afghan counterparts. We simply, my observation, we don't give it the level of effort that we would for combat operations, even though this is essentially a combat mission. For the 10th Mountain Division, we provide plenty of resources for those units and those organizations to form up before they go into theater, to plan their activities in theater in terms of combat operations, in terms of who's on their flanks, vertically and horizontally in theater? How are they going to relate to not just their command structure, but how are they going to exchange lessons learned from the cadre that's in theater? What command structure is there? They frequently send a command post forward before deployment to understand the operational environment. And the resources and time that they have before they deploy into theater, they spend on developing their teams, essentially, to conduct their mission in theater. On the advisor front, and hence the exposing one of our flanks, in the flank of ministerial capacity building and the advisors that we send into theater, it is essentially still come as you are, individual effort, with maybe some small teams. I was lucky to be in a team of civilian ministerial advisors that were joined up for about 7 weeks before then. And we're all sent in on different transport aircraft at different times. And we arrive in theater on a command structure that is already in existence. And we encounter that command structure basically on an individual basis and get brought into the command structure on an individual basis. With very little time for knowledge transfer, lessons learned transfer, or even really understanding operational environment. So unfortunately, advisors spend a majority of their time, the first couple months, just understanding the command structure that they're in, the do's and don'ts, what are the goals and objectives, and then they start to actually try to understand the operational environment. All things that really should be front-loaded before you go into theater. Another area that we've talked about with others at Maxwell is the whole role of contract advisors at the ministerial level. I have some thoughts on that, areas for improvement. Basically, my supposition is we need to, not only in Afghanistan, but in the future, rethink how we employ contract advisors at a ministerial level when they're performing inherently governmental functions from my perspective, where they're in positions where they're communicating messages for the U.S. government on a bilateral basis to a sovereign entity called the Afghan government. We shouldn't put the contractors in that position, and we shouldn't expect more successful outcomes when we do. I think there's also a lot that can be done before 2014 to actually work with the Afghans in a more partnered way. One of the saddest parts of my experience was how we consistently avoided opportunities to bring the Afghans into the problem-solving approach of building a Ministry of Defense and really building the security forces. Plenty of missed opportunities. We could have worked better with junior officers to develop that next generation of leadership. And as a result, we really didn't have much of a negotiation strategy or a negotiation framework for leveraging all of our resources to help the Afghans understand sort of the essential elements of building their security structures. And there's a way, based on international best practices, if I use the term mutual accountability framework, I think some people here in this room will understand that when you use those sorts of mechanisms with a bilateral partner, you can actually hold each other accountable for results in ways that we aren't really doing in Afghanistan right now, the ministerial capacity building level. And I think there's plenty of growth in areas for improvement there. I've gone way over. I apologize. This is an issue that's very close to my heart. I've got a number of lessons for the future that I can talk about in Q&A, but I'm glad to go through that question. Apologize for going too long. Sir?
I noticed a lot of the senior leaders in the Afghan government were trained originally by the Soviets in the 1980s. What advantages do you see in the way that they approach things when you got there?
It's a great question, and I think it goes to the kind of the mindset of a lot of the Afghan leaders. Fortunately, we were sensitized to this in our training pipeline, but I really didn't have a sense of how it worked until I got into theater, where there was definitely a large cadre, not the entire cadre, but most of the Afghan generals of a certain age group had been very shaped by Soviet training or their experience with the Soviet Army in the 1980s. Several of them had attended senior service schools, colleges in the Soviet Union or its satellite states, and had a certain perspective on what an institution should do and how it should function. So with those leaders, you really had to understand the kind of the educational or cognitive space that they came from, and then you adapted your advising strategy accordingly. And You also sought out advisors. We had a number of advisors that had been trained in Russia, spoke Russian, or were familiar with Soviet doctrine and organizational theory. And those were some of the strategies that I used. But it certainly had a huge impact.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about what everyone talks about as a perennial issue with security sector reform, which is the conceptual contention divide. So there's this whole template out there, and you keep referring to internationally recognized best practices, right? And then some of your stories are about how the Afghans were telling us we shouldn't do it this way, but I was listening to them, which violates one of the first principles of security sector reform, which is local ownership. So you come in sort of from DoD, which is the most highly developed civilian control operation of defense and security policy in the world, right? And you're trying to transplant some of these lessons to a country with GDP per capita of about $500, right? So how do you even go about thinking about how to bridge that conceptual contextual divide? I mean, if you'd had experience in even a place like Albania or El Salvador, which is much better off than Afghanistan, right, where they have many of these same problems, but how do you get across that gap? And you're talking about training civil servants to do civilian control. And as you probably know, most countries around the world don't really have a strong civilian service of people trained in security and defense policy able to engage in civilian control. So why is that a goal for Afghanistan? Should that even be on the list of priorities?
Yeah, and one of the things, I assume that, to take your second question first, and then I'll come back to the first question. I think it gets back to understanding that the challenge of sort of approaching a security sector challenge in Afghanistan from a perspective of the U.S. Department of Defense. You could say that there's a lot of hubris there, so sort of recognizing that it's important. But to answer your second question first, I think what I did not appreciate, and which I was lucky to pass the time after I got back to actually do some research, I assumed that we were trying to support the Afghans in what their constitution said, which is it is designed along Western models of civilian control through their president down into their governmental structure. So the relationship between security forces and the government. I assumed that was a U.S. objective. And I didn't find out until after my deployment that that wasn't really an explicit objective from the policymaker's perspective. Is it a nice to have? Yes. But were our policy and operational efforts associated with that objective? Apparently not. I think that was the wrong approach for a number of the reasons that I talked about. I just think one of my lessons learned for the future as it relates to sort of broader security sector reform efforts is I think there's a lot of value in starting at the end, not just an intermediary objective in terms of capacity building. So if you are trying to, long-term, you recognize that this is going to be a democratic state and they will need democratic control of their armed forces. Not having that as an intermediary objective will begin to shape the entire security apparatus in unhelpful ways, which we were just beginning to realize, I think, about the 2010-11 time. So I agree with you that it might not have been the right goal in terms of trying to completely achieve it by 2014 or some other baseline before 2014. But I think to not have it as part of a long-term campaign objective and then think about what are the intermediary steps was a mistake. Because we didn't take the time that we had when we had a lot of resources. But we literally could have, if we wanted to, as one option, I'm not saying this is the right one, we could have taken a cadre of 100 Afghans with a much lower amount of money, taken them out of the country, given them gold-plated education and instruction in public administration, language, etc., and brought them back into Afghanistan and put them in the ministry. 10 years later, and we would have been much more effective and much more further along. We didn't do that because it wasn't recognized as even a long-term goal in the short-term campaign. And I think that was a mistake. We could certainly do better. For your first question, I think one of the benefits of you saw there's some training pictures up behind me. One of the benefits of the program that I went through as a Ministerial Defense advisor, a program designed to attract DoD civilians to go through a training pipeline and prepare them to go into theater to do advising at the ministerial level. We were trained to unwire our approaches to education and advising so that we were operating on international standards of best practices associated with advising. You mentioned local ownership, do no harm, some of the other principles of making sure that you're not just taking your solution sets from the Department of Defense and mapping them into a very foreign culture and system. Unfortunately, I don't think we did a very good job of providing those tools to all of, not just the advisors, but the commanders in the field that were affecting that mission and making decisions that ran counter to those principles. Hopefully that answers your question. Sir, in back.
Famous British conservative Edmund Burke once said, the use of force is but temporary. It may subdue for a moment, but it does not remove the necessity of subduing again. And a nation is not governed that is perpetually to be conquered. So I guess my issue and my question is the National Security Council doing enough interagency coordination with the executive departments to achieve governance in Afghanistan? Because if your expertise is security sector reform, there comes a point where it has to move from security reform into governance reform. I'm a law student here, and I see a lot of issues with the rule of law not being developed enough. I was an advisor in Iraq, and what we saw was tribal networks and Iraqis adjudicating their grievances through backwater or back channel tribal courts instead of going to the Iraqi courts.
Sure.
What's being done from DOJ and the State Department in transferring security sector reform into permanent governance reform, specifically with establishing rule of law norms?
It's a great question, and I probably won't be able to give you a good answer because my scope and my sight picture was pretty limited when in theater. But I can share my observations. So when I was there, I did not observe what I thought could have been a better joined-up effort of interagency coordination and then applied unity of effort to building the security sector in a broader governance structure within Gyroa. I know there were tons of people working at multiple levels to develop governance, but I didn't observe at my level how those efforts connected to what I was doing on a daily basis. I'll give you an example. So as a ministerial advisor, I had daily or near daily contact with my counterparts. The person that I was working with, the assistant minister for strategy and policy, was technically the third or fourth person in the command structure of the Ministry of Defense. And we would have representatives from the U.S. Department of State, U.S. Embassy, come over and seek a bilateral meeting, again, representing the U.S. government, with my counterpart. And unfortunately, on multiple occasions, I was never told that they were coming. I had no idea what their objectives were. I infrequently heard the results of the meetings. And as a result, our U.S. effort and what I thought was a U.S. effort / NATO effort to build capacity in the Ministry of Defense was essentially moving right past each other. How does that relate back to your point about rule of law? I think there were lots of missed opportunities for the group of advisors that I was working with to be informed by other civilians in the U.S. government from state and aid that had great expertise in terms of how to build enduring governance structures in a foreign country, especially in a context like Afghanistan. We could have learned a lot about how to imbue our capacity building efforts with principles of rule of law. And we were struggling, frankly, with how do we get the nascent Ministry of Defense and Afghan National Army military court system wired in with national judicial procedures and courts across the government of Afghanistan. So a lot of missed opportunities that I observed. I hope it's getting fixed and improved, but I'm not highly confident based on what I hear from other advisors.
Thanks.
Can you talk a little bit more about assessment methodology? You mentioned institution building. How did, I guess, at a top level, how did you go about determining whether the institutions really were being built? I guess who was involved? What outcomes did you look at? And how did you determine which parts of your intervention were really working and which weren't?
It's a great question. I think an area where a program like this could actually add a lot of value to future dialogue. I'll just say up front, my sense of sort of the level of sophistication and replicability and really credibility of our assessment methodology with regards to really understanding who is building governance, appropriate governance in the tech sector, was weak and less than fully successful. Especially 10 years into the campaign and 11 years in. We just, I was floored that we didn't have better assessment methodology, that we didn't have a clearer sense of how we were measuring outcome and impact. And I think we weren't there for a couple different reasons. One, we didn't have the expertise in theater to do this right. Again, sort of a shameful fact of 10 to 11 years. We were asking mostly senior military officers, U.S. and coalition, to build governance at the senior levels of a foreign nation, a mission that very few senior military officers are either trained in, educated, or have experience in. But we essentially, collectively, delegated the authority for the Ministry of Defense's assessment in terms of whether an office or a function was at a successful level. There's a whole methodology, numbering scale. But that decision to approve an office in the Ministry of Defense was essentially delegated to a 3-star U.S. commander in the theater, who may or may not have had any experience in the office of the Secretary of Defense, in the Foreign Ministry of Defense, may or may not have had any experience understanding what the principal functions are of a ministry, of a state, and therefore put those people in a very difficult spot with regards to making campaign-level decisions about how to allocate resources on various lines of effort. So there were some sort of strategic issues with the assessment methodology. We also had very little, if any, observed oversight from places like the National Security Council staff or my counterparts in the Office of the Secretary of Defense on critical questions about show me and tell me and explain to me how these offices or functions are capable, and where they are capable and where they're not. I didn't observe those conversations happening in any sort of system. So as a result, unfortunately, you had several people in theater largely trying to develop this on their own in the middle of a combat zone with limited connectivity to the outside world through satellite communication. The occasional expert that may come in, some reach back capability, but again, you're back to the relay race, right? Person does all this research in theater, kind of gets an assessment methodology, and who do they hand over the baton to? A lot of times it's just sitting there, and you show up, and you've got, like I did, 4 books, 5 books, binders filled of prior assessments of various ministries going back to loosely 2006. And that's what I've inherited as someone who's then responsible for helping the command think through how to assess the performance and effectiveness of the Ministry of State. We just could have done a lot better. Now, there was a lot of work done by bright people to try to do it right. I think there are some lessons in the assessment methodology that are probably beneficial for the future. But I think this is a perfect example of what we can do better in the future. And not to toot the horn of the program that I'm working in association with right now, but the Department of Defense and other countries have a lot of expertise with regard to building capacity at the ministerial level that I think could be better harnessed in terms of helping commanders in the field and really civilian leaders in the field now think through what are the essential functions and what are the critical paths to develop in these ministries in conjunction with the Afghans. And it's really, how do you get the Afghans to sign up to, these are our priorities. And then really what was missing too was, how do you encourage the Afghans to develop their own assessment process? Because that's the process that we should be using and supporting and really building their capacity. We can build a really complex assessment methodology to map out nodes and understand how ministry ought to function. But unless the Afghans are actually designing an assessment methodology that allows them to make smart decisions about how to manage their ministry, all that assessment stuff that we do is basically just for us. It's not an enduring solution. Someone else gets to ask a question. I'll come back to that. Sure.
A couple of questions. First, the MOI and MOD coordination on the ground. If you could share your insights on that. Second, did you have a chance to look at how the MOD dealt with the Office of Administrative Affairs?
What's your background?
I spent 5 years in Afghanistan.
First question, second, and first question first, and then I'll follow up on the second question. And you need to get out of here. You bet. I'll find it. Okay. I have to be clear. I was working in Kabul. I was working with Afghans at the Ministry of Defense level. I was privileged to work in some joint working groups between the coalition and the Afghan government security sector cluster. So I did get to see some interministerial work. That's why you see some interministerial pictures behind me. My understanding of MOD and MOI cooperation on the ground is a derivation of those relationships in my job. So all that I saw and heard was secondhand. Between 2011 and 2012, I think, fortunately, one of the success stories that I talked about with Dave and Nick before the session was we were beginning to recognize that, as a coalition, that we needed to work, better amongst the coalition and then with the Afghans to bring their ministries together at the strategic level, to begin to plan for and assess their ability to transition the tranches, the geographic sections of Afghanistan and the 5 tranches of security transition. So what I observed in my time there was a growing, still nascent, but growing capacity for the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, and then the intelligence organization, NDS, to work together at the strategic level to assess security in a certain environment as well as governance factors. And they would bring in experts from other Afghan ministries like IDLG to give them inputs from the field so that the interministerial working group could make smarter decisions about this district or this province is maybe ready, here's the risk, etc. So I saw that through a couple different tranches improve over time. Lots to be improved, of course, going forward. And I think one of the areas that we didn't really grapple with, which hobbled implementation and cooperation between MOD and MOI, was there was an existential question about roles and missions between the police and the Army, and the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, about who should be doing what in 2014 and post-2014. The mission of border security, is that an internal Ministry of Interior law enforcement function, or is it, as the Army, thinking of their Soviet mindset, this is a role for the military. We should be doing border security as part of our territorial defense. And so those broader questions, I didn't observe them being resolved at the levels that they ought to have been. So I think that prevented some issues from being better coordinated and therefore executed. Your second question on the Office of Afghan Administration, right?
Administrative Affairs.
Administrative Affairs, excuse me, is a great one because I think it revealed a big gap in our knowledge of how the Afghan government works. We spent a lot of time as a coalition convincing the Afghans that they needed a National Security Council. And what I learned, I think about month 4 into my deployment, based on some work that was being done at ISAF, was the Afghans had a National Security Council. They just called it a cabinet. and they work through this Office of Administration to execute interministerial, cabinet-level decisions associated with sovereign control of their country. But yet, we had devoted all of this time building a structure that made us feel better. So one of the insights that I gleaned while being there, of course I wasn't aware of it before I joined here, was that there was this organization. It was important, and probably the people that I was working with had some relationship to it, but I unfortunately never really got a good sense of what those relationships were or ought to have been. And I think it was a real missed opportunity. But I think it's an endemic sign of, again, going back to the hubris, of sort of not taking the time to really understand the operational environment and listening to the Afghans about how they're governing their own country and how we can support those efforts by bringing solution sets like a National Security Council, which is not necessarily needed.
Yeah, then it's a structure that even survived the Taliban regime.
Right.
Thanks.
But good question, thank you. One more, Mr. Quinn?
Yeah, last question.
Sure.
So if I understand from your answer that nobody evaluated the capacity of security forces in Afghanistan.
I'm sorry?
Nobody evaluated in whole range the capacity of security forces in Afghanistan because it's hard to evaluate and many other problems. So I want to know your opinion. Will Afghan security forces be able to control the country after the Americans leave the country?
One of the big what-if questions, right? I can't give you a solid answer. I think a lot of it depends on variables that will not be resolved until we get to 2014. Everything can change if the Afghan election doesn't go well. So based on what I know right now, if all the sort of trend lines are on their path, I think we've got a reasonable chance of achieving our more limited U.S. policy objectives as we get to 2014. The Afghans have been demonstrating more capability and capacity, and I think as they gain more sovereign control, that will improve, because it will have to improve. What I worry about is the possibility of external resources and support diminishing to such a level that the Afghans don't have enough time and space to begin to identify how they're going to resource their own security needs, and that we, in that sort of bathtub of support, we will, before the Afghans build up their own capacity to resource their security needs inherently, that there's risk enough where the system starts to break down and people fall back on bad behavior and lessons of the past. The patronage networks begin to arm themselves, and that's what I worry about. So I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer than that.
So the history was the Soviet Union when they left the country can repeat?
Well, I mean, you probably know this better than I do, but my recollection of history was it wasn't the Soviets leaving, it was them turning off the spigot of resources to the point that the government of Afghanistan at the time didn't have the resources to provide security for the people. And then the people started going to alternative sources. So is there a possibility that something like that could happen? Yes, if we're not careful about how we think about the risk of drawing down our resource support too quickly, and we don't, as I've been trying to talk about in this discussion, really concertedly work with the Afghans to develop enduring solutions at the ministerial level so that they can govern and therefore understand the resources that they need to acquire to support their security.
Erik, I hate to cut you off.
Yeah.
I mean,